Welcome to ING's Think Aloud, where we try to make sense of the world in the most unbanky way we can. In today's episode,
with most of the country already under extreme measures, it's clear that we need to do more together to bring this new variant under control while our vaccines are rolled out. In England, we must therefore go into a national lockdown which is tough enough to contain this variant. The weeks ahead will be the hardest yet, but I really do believe that we're entering the last phase of the struggle.
UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson urging people to stay at home as a new strain of COVID-19 spreads rapidly across the country. The national lockdown means that schools, non-essential retail, pubs and restaurants will all remain shut until the middle of next month, when priority groups are expected to have been vaccinated and measures can be eased. In response to the lockdown, Chancellor Rishi Sunak has announced a £4.6 billion relief package, but many businesses fear that won't be enough and that more help may be needed. I'm Rebecca Byrne, and today I'm joined by James Smith, ING's Developed Markets Economist, to find out what impact the new restrictions will have on the British economy in the coming weeks and months. So, James, this new lockdown is similar to the one we experienced last March. Are you expecting a similar impact on the economy?
Hi, Rebecca. Yeah, well, as you say, in many ways, this is kind of similar to what we had earlier in 2020, where Prime Minister Boris Johnson is basically telling people that they're legally required to stay at home. The messaging is very similar. Schools are closed as well. But actually, from an economic perspective, it's a little bit different this time around. And the major difference actually is, unlike March, April time, more sectors are able to stay open, and the main one actually here is manufacturing, which is kind of roughly 10% of UK GDP. So that makes quite a big difference. The other thing, of course, is businesses have adapted. So if you're allowed to open, even partially, businesses are better set up for things like takeaway, click and collect. What we also saw last year was some businesses who actually didn't need to close did for a small period of time to implement safety measures and so on. So the dip's likely to be less severe this time around. To put some numbers on that, the first lockdown shaved about 25% off GDP in 2 months. So that's how far we were below pre-virus levels. Since then, we've had a bit of a recovery as stuff reopened. But this lockdown probably takes us to about 15% below pre-virus levels. So quite bad, but not quite as bad as before. Perhaps the more interesting thing is, how does this compare to November, when we also had a bit of a lockdown through that month? The main difference compared to then is really that schools are closed, which they weren't necessarily back then. Now, this has a direct effect in that it actually goes straight into GDP, odd though that may sound. But indirectly as well, of course, it means families are having to provide childcare, and in reality, that will hit sort of worker availability and so on, even if people are allowed to go out to work as normal. I guess the other thing that kind of goes without saying is that, you know, with the virus, according to the scientists this week, affecting 1 in 50 people in the UK, you know, just anecdotally, that's causing plenty of disruption with workers having to self-isolate and so on.
Yeah. Well, business leaders have been calling for more support, and Rishi Sunak just announced another £4.6 billion package of measures. But is that enough? Because 3/4 of businesses are saying they can't survive these new lockdown measures.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we've had some new top-ups really to the grants that have been offered in the past to businesses. Will it be enough? Very tricky to say, as you say. I mean, you know, it's a very difficult situation for businesses, particularly in those most heavily affected sectors. Just to quote another statistic, very similar to the one you've just mentioned, the ONS are saying when they've asked businesses, specifically in the hospitality sector, 1 in 5 of them are saying they have little or no confidence that they can survive the next 3 months. Now, I think probably the combination of grants and other support measures probably will keep most firms above water for the time being. But clearly, there's a very difficult question of what happens once some of these measures are unwound.
Well, exactly. The furlough job support scheme is due to be wound up at the end of April, isn't it? Is there a danger that these measures could be removed too soon? What's the outlook for the job market?
Yeah, I think this is one of the main risks this year. We talk a lot about the vaccination programme, but actually, you know, it comes back to these job support schemes too. Now, the furlough scheme, just as a reminder, enables firms to furlough employees. And it was basically unprecedented when it was unveiled back in 2020. So equally, there's a question, with that in mind, of how best to unwind it. It's not going to be straightforward. Now, the scheme's been extended until the end of April. I suspect that could get pushed back further. But at some point, the government's likely to revert back to something closer to what they'd originally lined up for the autumn, which was basically where the Treasury subsidises wages, where workers are brought back on a part-time basis. And the question, I guess, is whether the shift to this kind of scheme comes before the most heavily affected sectors are really back on their feet. So even if we get some reopening in the spring, it's going to be gradual. It might, for instance, be some time before we're back at large events and that kind of thing. So let's give a sense of the scale of the potential risk. We know at the end of October, which was when the original scheme was meant to end, around 1 million, or actually over 1 million workers were still fully furloughed back then. Now, some of those probably would have returned back to work if the scheme had stopped, but many will be working in areas that have been heavily constrained by social distancing. So that gives a flavour of the risk, perhaps. So when we come to the spring and the summer, we may unfortunately see a bit of a rise in unemployment further than we've already had, depending on how and when the scheme is unwound. And that in turn, of course, will weigh on the speed of the overall recovery.
Is the new fiscal support likely to have any impact on monetary policy? Back in November, the Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey said that the bank doesn't set a level of quantitative easing and asset purchases that's in any way related to what the government is going to borrow. But a survey in the FT shows that the markets just don't believe that.
Yeah, this is quite interesting. I mean, actually, when we're talking about monetary policy in the short term, the real question right now is, or the real short-term question is whether the Bank of England goes down the path of negative rates. And it's a debate we've been having for quite a while now. But I think this quarter is really when this debate's going to come to a head. And one thing the bank's done is consult commercial banks on what the impact would be on their businesses. And Bank of England officials have signalled that they're going to unveil the results of that in February. Now, this is quite important because obviously one of the key arguments put forward against below sub-zero rates is the impact on banks. But actually, I don't think this is really where the decision hinges for the Bank of England. Instead, it's much more about, is this actually a useful thing to do from an economic perspective? And here, actually, the committee is much more divided. One of the interesting things that's come out of the last few months is sort of a preference from Governor Bailey, who's kind of said that QE is more favourable to interest rates. He said it's a kind of more potent tool, particularly in the short term. And actually, one implication of that, when we're well into the recovery phase, is that it might be that the bank thinks more carefully, was more inclined to start reducing the number of bonds it holds. It's accumulated as a result of QE more quickly than it's done in the past, perhaps quite early on in any tightening cycle. Now, that brings us back to that original question you posed about the link with fiscal policy, because the whole debate about whether this amounts to kind of monetary financing, de facto monetary financing, because in the short term, maybe it resembles that, but in the medium term, if the bank does start unwinding its balance sheet, then perhaps it's a slightly different story.
Well, let's talk about the recovery a little bit. We have a vaccine, obviously, which is being rolled out, and the aim is to open up gradually in March. So what's your forecast for the second quarter and beyond? How vigorous do you expect the recovery to be? Will it be V-shaped?
Well, the hope is things should get better from the spring. Of course, the UK is rather ambitiously committed to vaccinating all over 70s and a few other priority groups by mid-February. And the hope is that, something like that will be possible, given that we have the AstraZeneca vaccine coming on stream, which, and in theory, with around 2 million deliveries a week, coupled with this plan to deliver as many first doses as possible, the hope is that, the target will come close to being met potentially. There's obviously a bit of a debate around that, but I think the key thing is it does open the door to the majority of priority groups receiving their first dose by sort of Easter time. The hope then, of course, is that will contribute to a significant fall in the number of people being hospitalised. So I suppose what we really need to ask is, what point does the government judge the risk has been sufficiently reduced to reopen? Now, as you said in your question, we might get some tentative steps towards that late into the first quarter, but probably more sizable reopening will come gradually through the second quarter. So if we're looking at that kind of schedule, then maybe we're looking at a sort of 6 or 7% rebound in GDP through the second quarter, and that would follow probably about 3% fall in the first. The important thing, though, of course, to say is this sort of recovery process is going to take a while. It's going to be probably an unfortunate legacy of higher unemployment, and therefore it's probably going to take beyond 2021 before the economy really reaches its pre-virus size.
We can't talk about the outlook for the economy without mentioning Brexit. Of course, we did get a deal at the end of 2020, so we've avoided tariffs and a lot of possible disruption. What did you make of the deal?
Yeah, I mean, any kind of deal really was going to be preferable to no deal, but I think it's nevertheless, a long way away from what we're used to in terms of the single market, customs union access that businesses have been accustomed to. Now, as you say, we maybe aren't necessarily seeing the pictures and videos of huge backlogs of lorry queues as we might have originally expected. But of course, we did see that in December when France shut the border with the UK out of concern of this new COVID variant. Now, while that wasn't directly about Brexit, what you have to remember, of course, is around 80 or 90% of hauliers on that Dover to Calais route, very important for goods trade, are European, not UK based. And you get the impression that many of those transport firms are very wary about sending drivers over to the UK in case there is a repeat of that December chaos. I think it's also true that many firms stockpiled in December to minimise, what they're having to bring in now and just sort of see how things go. But that's not to say there's no disruption at all. Actually, far from it. There's loads of reports coming through almost every day now of firms struggling to get stuff across the border in both directions, particularly where suppliers are perhaps smaller businesses, maybe aren't up to speed yet on what paperwork is required and how to go about it. VAT, for example, is proving to be a particular headache for European exporters to the UK. Now, how does that affect the wider economy? Well, it means firms will be facing issues with their supply chains in the short term. And in some instances, that could lead to sort of factory shutdowns, partial or full, like we saw back in December. Now, I think to be clear, don't expect this to sort of really shine through too clearly on GDP charts, because that's going to be dominated by COVID volatility. But it will undoubtedly have an impact. It will push up costs. And in the end, what do higher costs mean? Lower investment and hiring. So certainly in the medium term, this is probably an issue.
So it's been very messy, it's been very distracting, and it's been that way for several years. But the UK was able to secure a tariff-free trade deal without contributing to the budget, the EU's budget, and without having to unilaterally follow the EU's rules. So despite all the struggles that are going on, is this going to make other countries like Norway, for example, question why they can't get a similar deal?
You're completely right to say that Brexit's been the dominating factor in the press ever since the referendum. I think we're all a bit tired of it, but I don't think we should assume it's going to go away now as an issue. I mean, there's various parts of this deal that require ongoing negotiation. I mean, fishing's an example after a sort of initial transition phase, but there's various other things too that are going to require sort of ongoing negotiations. And the other thing is, while that contentious issue of level playing fields, things like environmental standards, state aid and so on, that was kind of settled, the perception of a lot of people that have been looking at the deal is that the sort of dispute resolution system and the mechanisms to help police that is fairly complicated. And the risk is that if these mechanisms don't actually work so well in practice, you could kind of see things descend into a bit of a tit for tat retaliation and tariffs if, say, the UK were to diverge away from the EU on some of these level playing field issues. So sort of putting that together, in the medium term, the relationship's likely to be characterized by sort of A, ongoing negotiations, but B, also some instability. And in that sense, some have been likening it to the situation Switzerland's had with the EU over a number of years, where it's been a little bit volatile. So coming back to that final part of the question, does it make others more likely to follow? I think it's still an open question. I mean, certainly the perception is that sort of populist forces that helped contribute to Brexit are going to continue to exist in parts of Europe too. But whether sort of these sort of anti-European parties, Eurosceptic parties, will view full exit from the EU and an arm's length economic relationship as the answer after what the UK's kind of been through, I think is maybe more questionable.
Okay, James Smith, ING's Developed Markets Economist. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
This podcast has been prepared by ING solely for information purposes, irrespective of a particular user's means, financial situation, or investment objective. The information does not constitute investment recommendation, and nor is it investment, legal, or tax advice, or an offer or solicitation to purchase or sell any financial instrument. Read more at think.ing.com/content-disclaimer.